Before we jump into today's episode, if you're not already subscribed to this podcast, do subscribe and give this podcast a rating. It helps tremendously. And without further ado, let's get into it. Until my 30th year, I lived in a state of almost continuous anxiety, interspersed with periods of suicidal depression. It feels now as if I am talking about some past life or somebody else's life. One night, not long after my 29th birthday, I woke up in the early hours with a feeling of absolute dread. I had woken up with such a feeling many times before, but this time, it was more intense than it had ever been. The silence of the night, the vague outlines of the furniture in the dark room, the distant noise of a passing train, everything felt so alien, so hostile, and so utterly meaningless that it created in me a deep loathing of the world. The most loathsome thing of all, however, was my own existence. What was the point in continuing to live with this burden of misery? Why carry on with this continuous struggle? I could feel that a deep longing for annihilation, for non-existence, was now becoming much stronger than the instinctive desire to continue to live. I cannot live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating itself in my head. Then suddenly, I became aware of what a peculiar thought it was. Am I one or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the I and the self, that I cannot live with. Maybe, I thought, only one of them is real. I was so stunned by this strange realization that my mind stopped. I was fully conscious, but there were no more thoughts. Then I felt drawn into what seemed like a vortex of energy. It was a slow movement at first, and then accelerated. I was gripped by an intense fear, and my body started to shake. I heard the words, "Resist nothing," as if spoken inside my chest. I could feel myself being sucked into a void. I felt as if the void was inside myself rather than outside. Suddenly, there was no more fear, and I let myself fall into that void. I have no recollection of what happened after that. I was awakened by the chirping of a bird outside the window. I had never heard such a sound before. My eyes were still closed, and I saw the image of a precious diamond. Yes, if a diamond could make a sound, this is what it would sound like. This is what it would be. I opened my eyes. The first light of dawn was filtering through the curtains. Without any thought, I felt I knew that there is infinitely more to light than we realize. That soft luminosity filtering through the curtains was love itself. Tears came into my eyes. I got up and walked around the room. I recognized the room, and yet I knew that I had never truly seen it before. Everything was fresh and pristine, as if it had come into existence. I picked up things, a pencil, an empty bottle, marveling at the beauty and aliveness of it all. That day, I walked around the city in utter amazement at the miracle of life on earth, as if I had just been born into this world. For the next 5 months, I lived in a state of uninterrupted deep peace and bliss. After that, it diminished somewhat in intensity, or perhaps it just seemed to because it became my natural state. I could still function in the world, although I realized that nothing I ever did could possibly add anything to what I already had. I knew, of course, that something profoundly significant had happened to me, but I didn't understand it all. It wasn't until several years later, after I had read spiritual texts and spent time with spiritual teachers, that I realized that what everybody was looking for had already happened to me. I understood that the intense pressure of suffering that night must have forced my consciousness to withdraw from its identification with the unhappy and deeply fearful self, which is ultimately a fiction of the mind. This withdrawal must have been so complete that this false, suffering self immediately collapsed, just as if a plug had been pulled out of an inflatable toy. What was left then was my true nature, as the ever-present I am, consciousness in its pure state prior to identification with form. Later, I also learned to go into the inner, timeless and deathless realm, that I had originally perceived as a void and remain fully conscious. This is an excerpt from The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And as you just listened to that introduction, he, for 30 years, lived an absolutely horrible life, according to him, where he was continually depressed and he was on the verge of committing suicide. But in his lowest point, he somehow managed to have this profound realization that the sense of self is a construct where the I and the self are not the same. The Power of Now, this book, is a guide to people who are seeking a way to understand how to live, and most importantly, how to live in this moment, in this present moment, versus living for the future or living in the past. This book is not only a helpful introduction to mysticism, but also a continual resource for diving deeper into how you live without anxiety, live in the present moment. So Eckhart Tolle opens the book with the story of a beggar, and I quote, "A beggar had been sitting by the side of a road for over 30 years. One day, a stranger walked up. 'Spare some change?' mumbled the beggar, mechanically holding out his baseball cap. 'I have nothing to give you,' said the stranger. Then he asked, 'What's that you're sitting on?' 'Nothing,' said the beggar, 'just an old box. I've been sitting on it for as long as I can remember.' 'Ever looked inside?' asked the stranger. 'No,' said the beggar. 'What's the point? There's nothing in there.' 'Have a look inside,' insisted the stranger. The beggar managed to pry open the lid. With astonishment, disbelief, and elation, he saw that the box was filled with gold. 'I am that stranger who has nothing to give you, and who is telling you to look inside. Not inside any box, as in the parable, but somewhere even closer, inside yourself.' 'But I am not a beggar,' I can hear you say. Those who have not found their true wealth, which is the radiant joy of being and the deep, unshakable peace that comes with it, are beggars, even if they have great material wealth. They are looking outside for scraps of pleasures or fulfillment, for validation, security, or love, while they have a treasure within that not only includes all those things, but is infinitely greater than anything the world can offer." What a way to open a book. And you'll notice that there's similarity between what Eckhart Tolle says and the books that we've studied in the past few episodes. The idea that true wealth is not external praises, external possessions. True wealth is the wisdom that you have, the knowledge that you have, and also the sense of peace that you have, right? It's this understanding of being able to live in the moment without foregoing the moment. The whole time that I was reading this, the one book and person that kept coming back to me was Csikszentmihalyi's Flow and Finding Flow, the episode that we did. Because what Mihaly says in his book and what he found through his research is the best way that humans can live a fulfilled life is to live in a state of flow, right? And what he calls flow is when the task is difficult, but you also have the skill set to match it. And when those two things match, there's that slight challenge, but also the ability to overcome that challenge, to transcend that challenge. That is what will put you into flow state. And as we go through The Power of Now, that's one thing that you'll notice and also realize that what Tolle is trying to get here is for you to be in a state of presence, for you to live in the here and the now. You have to be fully aware, fully conscious of everything that's happening. And he tells a story of some monks where when young monks are practicing meditation, practicing this sense of awareness, the older monks will sometimes sneak up behind them and hit them with a bat. And the monks who are fully aware, fully present in the here and now, conscious of everything around them, will be able to dodge the bat that's about to hit them. But the ones whose minds are occupied by what happened in the past, by what they're looking forward in the future, by the worries, by the anxieties, they're the ones who get hit because they're not aware of it. And that's actually a great analogy for us, for how to live, for when you are spending time with your family, for when you're spending time with your friends. Are you fully present? Are you there? So continuing One interesting thing with Tolle's book is controversial in many circles because some people view him as a new age teacher, some people view him as a mystic, some people think that his teachings are false and should not be listened to. And the fact that I'm doing this episode on his book means that I find value in what Tolle says. So I don't really care what other people think about this, and I think you should read this book for yourself. The way this book is written is somewhat of a question and answer, right? So he's sort of amalgamating questions that have been asked to him over the years and then giving a response to it. And oftentimes his responses are 2, 3, 4, 5 pages long. And right in the beginning, somebody asks him about God and being. And Tolle says, I don't really like to use the word God because it's been misused and it tends to conjure up different ideas and concepts for different people. So he says, the word God has become empty of meaning through thousands of years of misuse. By misuse, I mean that people who have never even glimpsed the realm of the sacred, the infinite vastness behind that word, use it with great conviction, as if they knew what they are talking about, or argue against it as if they knew what it is that they are denying. And his point here is there's a huge gap, a huge chasm between simple knowledge acquisition and those who understand and those who have experienced it. Because once you've apprehended the vastness, the infinite vastness, then you will start to realize that the squabbles that are happening are oftentimes over misunderstandings. And there's a story as I was reading this that came to my mind. So there was an interreligious conference that happened. And at this conference, there were priests and monks from all different walks of faith, right? So there's the Christians, the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Hindus, and so on and so forth. And at this conference, one of the things that became quite obvious was that all the priests and the theologians from all different walks of faith were arguing with each other, arguing over concepts, arguing over whose God is real, arguing over the different attributes of God. While in contrast, all the monks of all the different faiths were peacefully sitting and enjoying each other's presence and laughing and having a grand old time. And I think that sums up the point that Eckhart Tolle is trying to make. Those who've experienced whatever that term God means, where he says it's the infinite vastness, versus those who have not experienced it, the difference is that one will continue to argue and debate and be willing to do all sorts of things in trying to prove a point. And so what Tolle is trying to get at is, he says, the problem that the modern world is facing is that they don't know how to stop thinking. By thinking, he means this type of overthinking and overanalyzing and not being able to let go of the past, the pain and all this. We'll get into that a bit further on, but he says, not being able to stop thinking is a dreadful affliction, but we don't realize this because almost everybody is suffering from it, so it is considered normal. The good news is that you can free your mind. This is the only true liberation. So he goes on to say, the predominance of mind is no more than a stage in the evolution of consciousness. We need to go to the next stage now as a matter of urgency, otherwise we will be destroyed by the mind, which has grown into a monster. Thinking and consciousness are not synonymous. Thinking is only a small aspect of consciousness. Thought cannot exist without consciousness, but consciousness does not need thought. Enlightenment means rising above thought, not falling back to a level below thought, the level of an animal or a plant. In the enlightened state, you still use your thinking mind when needed, but in a much more focused and effective way than before. You use it mostly for practical purpose, but you are free of the involuntary internal dialogue, and there is inner peace. When you do use your mind, and particularly when a creative solution is needed, you oscillate every few minutes or so between thought and stillness, between mind and no mind. No mind is consciousness without thought. Only in that way is it possible to think creatively, because only in that way does thought have any real power. Thought alone, when it is no longer connected with the much vaster realm of consciousness, quickly becomes barren, insane, and destructive. So you're getting the sense that What Tolle is teaching is this idea of getting to a stage where you have complete inner stillness, being able to be at peace with yourself, being able to exist in the solitude, in the silence of your soul. One of the things that this reminded me of was a book that I got many Christmases ago from my wife, and it's called Silence by Robert Cardinal Sarah. And it was that book that was monumental in how I understood silence, solitude, and there's a lot of similarities between what Tolle says with what Cardinal Sarah says. And there's this sense in which, for Cardinal Sarah, if you want to find God, you're not going to find him in the distracting, noisy world. You're not going to find him in your loud prayers, in your loud worship. You're only going to find God in the stillness of your soul, when you are silent and when there is no distraction, because you have transcended that distraction. And in that silence in your heart, in your mind, that's when you're going to find God. Returning now to the power of now, one of the interesting things that he briefly mentions but skips over is he says, even the great scientists have reported that the creative breakthroughs came at a time of mental quietude. And this is very true. A ton of scientific discoveries have come through dreams. I'm going to give you some examples of this so you can think of one. Dmitri Mendeleev, he's the guy who invented the periodic table. Dmitri spent hours grappling with how to organize, all the different chemical elements, and he was exhausted and fell asleep at his desk. And when he woke up in his dream, he saw the periodic table. So he writes, in a dream, I saw a table where all the elements fell into place as required. Another very famous example of this is in mathematics. There's a famous Indian mathematician called Srinivasa Ramanujan. He had very little formal education. There's even a movie that was done about him. Ramanujan had very little formal education in math. He ended up corresponding with Hardy, who was a professor of mathematics at Cambridge. And Hardy was convinced that Ramanujan was a genius. So he brought him over to Cambridge, and they would work on all these theorems that he was doing. In the course of his lifetime, very short life, mind you, that Ramanujan had, he produced 4,000 mathematical proofs, identities, and equations. And Ramanujan not just believed, but Ramanujan claimed that all the mathematical equations that he was getting and he was able to discover was through a Hindu goddess called Namagiri Tarayan. And he even wrote it down, saying that all his proofs come from her. She appears to him in a dream and flings the proofs in his dreams, and then he wakes up and he remembers them and writes it down. So this idea of being still, this idea of being present in the moment is quite a powerful practice to implement in our lives. Now, one of the main things that prevents people from getting into this state of living in the present moment is pain. It's the past. It's what has happened in the past. So Tolle writes, the greater part of human pain is unnecessary. It is self-created as long as the unobserved mind runs your life. The pain that you create now is always some form of non-acceptance, some form of unconscious resistance to what it is. Very similar to a quote by Seneca when he says, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. But both of these are pointing to the fact that oftentimes we make ourselves suffer. We make ourselves reside in the pain longer than it needs to be because we're stuck in the past, and we have to be able to pull ourselves away from it. And Tolle continually says, whatever has happened in the past, if you can live in this present moment, there is no pain, there is no suffering here and now. And the more you're able to find the stillness, the inner peace, the more you'll realize that all this pain that you're having, what he calls the pain body, you'll be able to transcend this. Actually, he says, you'll be able to transmute this pain and turn it into peace. And this is what he says. A pain body may be dormant 90% of the time. In a deeply unhappy person, though, it may be active up to 100% of the time. Some people live entirely through their pain body, while others may experience it only in certain situations, such as intimate relationships or situations linked with past loss or abandonment, physical or emotional hurt. And I'm continuing. So the pain body doesn't want you to observe it directly or see it for what it is. The moment you observe it, feel its energy, feel within you, and take your attention into it, the identification is broken and a higher dimension of consciousness has come in. I call it presence. So Tolle wants us to understand that the pain that you feel, the moment you can observe it and not identify with the pain and take a second-person perspective on it, that identification that you have with this, what he calls pain body, gets broken. And then he says a higher dimension of consciousness has come in, which is just presence. So he says, realize deeply that the present moment is all you ever have. Make the now the primary focus of your life. The most important thing is understanding that only this present moment is here. The past, though it's happened, you can't go back to the past. The future, it hasn't happened and you can't go into the future. The present state is the future that you were waiting for in the past. And so if you continually live in the past or you continually live in the future, you're going to miss the present. And that's something Tolle talks about over and over again. This cannot be understated. In your journey to implementing this teaching of how to live in this present moment, what's a practical way of doing this? Tolle says, focus attention on the feeling inside you. Know that it is the pain body. Accept that it is there. Don't think about it. Don't let the feeling turn into thinking. Don't judge or analyze. Don't make an identity for yourself out of it. It's allowing that pain to come through you, just like a water flowing through you. And in so doing, you are able to not identify with it and not make an identity out of it. And the reason he says an identity out of it is he talks about how many people love to identify with their traumas, with their pain. And because they identify with their trauma, with their pain, they get stuck. And they get stuck in the past. And they're unable to leave their past. And that is what haunts them. And that's what haunted him, as you listen to in the excerpt. He's saying once you're able to not identify yourself with the pain, but allow the pain to flow through you, that is when you'll be able to live in the present moment. So from there, he goes on to talk about how you have to master being present in the moment. You have to be able to transmute the pain, the suffering. And so he says, power over others is weakness disguised as strength. True power is within, and it is available to you now. That's a similar concept within the Stoics, within Buddhist tradition, within Christian traditions. All of them have this idea of overcoming yourself and mastering yourself, and how that is the true power. So the Buddha says, though one were to conquer 1,000,000 men in battle, that man who conquers himself is the greater victor. And Epictetus says, most men want to rule over others, but the great and wise man rules over himself. Tolle goes on to say, the more you focus on time, past and future, the more you miss the now, the most precious thing there is. Why is it the most precious thing? Firstly, because it is the only thing. It's all there is. The eternal present is the space within which your whole life unfolds. Like everything that you do happens now. Everything that you've ever done happened now, back then. Meaning the present state is all that you ever have, is all that we ever have. And so if you miss living in this present state, Tolle goes on to say it is something you'll end up missing living in this life. And he talks about unlocking this dimension, right? This dimension of living in this present state. And I quote, the reason why some people love to engage in dangerous activities, such as mountain climbing, car racing, and so on, although they may not be aware of it, it is that it forces them into the now. That intensely alive state that is free of time, free of problems, free of thinking, free of the burden of the personality. Slipping away from the present moment, even for a second, may mean death. Unfortunately, they come to depend on a particular activity to be in that state. But you don't need to climb the north face of the Eiger. You can enter that state now. And I've mentioned before that one of the activities that I do that allows me to get into flow state is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And you'll hear from many practitioners who say the same thing. Because when you are training, there is nothing else you can think about. You have to be fully focused on the present state, on that particular time. And I think Tolle's point is a good reminder that you don't need to climb the north face of the Eiger. You don't need to train only Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You don't need to only do rock climbing, biking. You can enter that state now. And one of the things that popped in my head when I was reading this, there's a story of this guy called Obi-Wan Nairobi. That's his nickname, of course, but his real name is Christian Craighead. And Christian Craighead was part of the SAS, which is the elite military in the UK. And Christian was in Nairobi on training the Nairobi Special Forces when he got a call from his friend saying that famous hotel/complex was attacked by a bunch of terrorists. And so Craighead goes to this place and single-handedly defeats all these terrorists. And he saves, I believe, around 400 people that day. I highly recommend checking some of the interviews that he's done. But in one particular interview on the Sean Ryan podcast, Christian Craighead talks about how when he entered that building, right, knowing full well that he could die, knowing full well that there were multiple terrorists inside killing people, that he might not come back out. He says that it was the first time in his life that he got into this higher dimension of flow state. And he says, I've gotten into flow states before, but this was like nothing. Everything became clearer. I could hear further than I could ever hear before. I could see further than I could ever see before. I could smell things. And he was saying I could sense everything around me. Now, the point of bringing up Christian Craighead or / Obi-Wan Nairobi is that what Tolle says is actually spot on. People are able to get into the state, into a much higher state of flow when it's life or death situation. And what Tolle is encouraging the readers is you can get into that state without the danger, right? You can get into that flow state here and now at your house. You don't have to wait for a death situation. You don't have to wait for a dangerous situation to arise for you to enter into the state. One of the comments made when discussing this state, this flow state, is somebody who says, I noticed this tree for the first time without any filter, and I could see all the leaves. I could see more colors than I'd ever seen before. But it seems like it's just a glimpse. Like it seems like it comes and goes. Is it possible to exist in this state? And Tolle goes on to say, you have had a glimpse of how the timeless can transform your perspective. But an experience is not enough, no matter how beautiful or profound. What is needed and what we are concerned with is a permanent shift in consciousness. So break the old pattern of present moment denial and present moment resistance. Make it your practice to withdraw attention from past and future whenever they are not needed. And immediately following up to this, a question comes up saying, well, isn't it still true that sometimes the future is going to be better than the present state? Right? If you are going through a difficult time, isn't the future better? Isn't the future going to give you hope to overcome, to be able to make it through the present state? And so Tolle goes on to say, you may win $10 million, but that kind of change is no more than it's skin deep. You would simply continue to act out the same conditioned patterns in the more luxurious surroundings. Humans have learned to split the atom. Instead of killing 10 or 20 people with a wooden club, one person can kill 1,000,000 just by pushing a button. Is that real change? If it is the quality of your consciousness at this moment that determines the future, then what is it that determines the quality of your consciousness? Your degree of presence. So the only place where true change can occur and where the past can be dissolved is the now. All negativity is caused by an accumulation of psychological time and denial of the present. Unease, anxiety, tension, stress, worry. All forms of fear are caused by too much future and not enough presence. Guilt, regret, resentment, grievance, sadness, bitterness, and all forms of non-forgiveness are caused by too much past and not enough presence. Most people find it difficult to believe that a state of consciousness totally free of negativity is possible, and yet this is the liberated state to which all spiritual teachings point. His point is the only difference between the future and the present and the past is that the present is the future that your past self was waiting for, and the past is simply the present state that you've missed. And so to change any sort of character, to have any real change in how you live and how you act out in the world, according to Tolle, is to be fully present in the now. And the more you can get that, the more you can hone this practice, the more peace and inner stillness you're going to find. So instead of waiting for the future, live in this present. And he goes on to say, waiting is a state of mind. Basically, it means that you want the future. You don't want the present. You don't want what you've got, and you want what you haven't got. With every kind of waiting, you unconsciously create inner conflict between your here and now and where you don't want to be, and the projected future where you want to be. This greatly reduces the quality of your life by making you lose the present. There is nothing wrong with striving to improve your life situation. You can improve your life situation, but you cannot improve your life. Life is primary. Life is your deepest inner being. It is already whole, complete, and perfect. Your life situation consists of your circumstances and your experiences. There is nothing wrong with setting goals and striving to achieve things. The mistake lies in using it as a substitute for the feeling of life for being. The only point of access for that is the now. You are then like an architect who pays no attention to the foundation of a building, but spends a lot of time working on the superstructure. That's beautifully said. Right? It's not that you cannot have goals. It's not that you cannot have aspirations, but it's that you don't want to live for the future. You don't want to say that your life is not whole or complete until you've achieved these things or until you've attained these things. Because if you do, you're going to live in this cycle of waiting for the future to come. And when the future comes, when you attain the future that you'd been waiting for, that future doesn't satisfy you because you're always living in the future. This is a common theme that you'll hear from with many people where they say, oh, I set a goal to get X amount of dollars. Oh, I set a goal to buy a big house. Or I set a goal to, 10X, 20X my company revenue. But then when I got it, I realized actually I want to make it even bigger, get more of it. And the reason this happens is we haven't gone to the point of being fully in the present. Because if you are fully in the present, you will know when enough is enough. And that is the point that the book that we did on Proverbs, book that we did with the Buddha, the Dhammapada, is the wise man knows when enough is enough. The wise man is able to understand that no future will give him the assurance, the stillness, the peace that he does not already have now. And if he doesn't already have it now, he will not have it in the future. Tolle goes on to say, many people are waiting for prosperity. It cannot come in the future. When you honor, acknowledge, and fully accept your present reality, where you are, who you are, and what you are doing right now. When you fully accept what you've got, you are grateful for what you've got, grateful for being, gratitude for the present moment and the fullness of life. Now is true prosperity. It cannot come in the future. Then in time, that prosperity manifests for you in various ways. If you are dissatisfied with what you've got, or even frustrated or angry about your present lack, that may motivate you to become rich. But even if you do make millions, you will continue to experience the inner condition of lack. Deep down, you will continue to feel unfulfilled. You may have many exciting experiences that money can buy, but they will come and go and always leave you with an empty feeling and the need for further physical or psychological gratification. You won't abide in being and so feel the fullness of life. Now that alone is true prosperity. And he goes on to say later on, a few pages down, ultimately, of course, every outer purpose is doomed to fail sooner or later, simply because it is subject to the law of impermanence of things. The sooner you realize that your outer purpose cannot give you lasting fulfillment, the better. When you have seen the limitations of your outer purpose, you give up your unrealistic expectation that it should make you happy, and you make it subservient to your inner purpose. Every future goal, every future desire, even when you attain all those things, you realize that they are impermanent, right? They are not lasting. The only thing that lasts is yourself, and you exist in this moment. And when you can be comfortable and at peace with yourself in this moment, Tolle says, that is true prosperity, because you don't need anything else, right? You have everything that you ever want. Insofar as the more you give yourself to the moment, to the present, to the here and now, the more the moment gives itself to you. Right? It sounds very strange when I say it that way. And Tolle says, only the present can free you from the past. More time cannot free you of time. Access the power of now. That is the key. Right, all this sounds good and all, but isn't it impossible to not have any cravings? Isn't it impossible to not have any sort of desires, future aspirations? And Tolle says, all cravings are the mind seeking salvation or fulfillment in external things and in the future as a substitute for the joy of being. As long as I am my mind, I am those cravings, those needs, wants, attachments, and aversions, and apart from them there is no I, except as a mere possibility, an unfulfilled potential, a seed that has not yet sprouted. In that state, even my desire to become free or enlightened is just another craving for fulfillment or completion in the future. So don't seek to become free of desire or achieve enlightenment. Become present. Be there as the observer of the mind. Instead of quoting the Buddha, be the Buddha. Be the awakened one, which is what the word Buddha means. Humans have been in the grip of pain for eons. Ever since they fell from the state of grace, entered the realm of time and mind, and lost awareness of being. At that point, they started to perceive themselves as meaningless fragments in an alien universe, unconnected to the source and to each other. Pain is inevitable as long as you are identified with your mind, which is to say unconscious, spiritually speaking. I am talking here primarily of emotional pain, which is also the main cause of physical pain and physical diseases. Resentment, hatred, self-pity, guilt, anger, depression, jealousy, and so on. Even the slightest irritation are all forms of pain. And every pleasure or emotional high contains within itself the seed of pain. Its inseparable opposite, which will manifest in time. Anybody who has ever taken drugs to get high will know that the high eventually turns into a low, that the pleasure turns into some form of pain. Many people also know from their own experience how easily and quickly an intimate relationship can turn from a source of pleasure to a source of pain. Seen from a high perspective, both the negative and the opposite polarities are faces of the same coin, are both part of the underlying pain that is inseparable from the mind-identified egoic state of consciousness. And he goes on to say this identification with this pain is because of what he calls ordinary unconsciousness. And so he explains, what I call ordinary unconsciousness means being identified with your thought processes and emotions, your reactions, desires, and aversions. It is most people's normal state. In that state, you are run by the egoic mind, and you are unaware of being. It is not a state of acute pain or unhappiness, but of an almost continuous low level of unease, discontent, boredom, and nervousness, a kind of background static. You may not realize this because it is so much a part of normal living, just as you are not aware of a continuous low background noise, such as the hum of an air conditioner, until it stops. When it suddenly does stop, there is a sense of relief. Many people use alcohol, drugs, sex, food, work, television, or even shopping as anesthetics in an unconscious attempt to remove the basic unease. When this happens, an activity that might be very enjoyable if used in moderation becomes imbued with a compulsive or addictive quality, and all that is ever achieved through it is extremely short-lived symptom relief. It's our inability to face the pain and allow the pain to face the pain and be aware of the pain fully that, according to Tolle, what ends up causing people to use alcohol, drugs, sex, food as a way to numb this pain, right? But in so doing, it creates what he calls the ordinary unconsciousness. It's sort of this zombie way of life where you're just living without actually being present. And so he says later on, every addiction arises from an unconscious refusal to face and move through your own pain. Every addiction starts with pain and ends with pain. Whatever substance you are addicted to, alcohol, food, drugs, a person, you are using something or somebody to cover up your pain. And how do you get rid of this pain? How do you transmute this pain? For Tolle, the way to transmute this pain is to accept the pain, right? To be present, to allow the pain to travel through you and pay attention to it. And in paying attention to it, you are no longer identifying yourself with that pain, and so then you are able to break away from this pain. And previously I've used the term transcend pain, and I actually like the term transmute to help understand this. When you are suffering, the only way to overcome that suffering is to face that suffering. And when you're facing it, you have to observe it and allow the pain to seep through your entire body, to seep through your entire being. It is only through that are you able to get to a point where you no longer identify with that pain and you accept the pain. But it is in the inability to accept the pain, it is in the ability to accept the suffering, that you will continue to suffer precisely for those reasons. So then suppose you've done this, right? Suppose you face the pain, suffering, and now you're seeking for peace, but you're unable to find peace, right? What do you do then? And Tolle says, you are still seeking outside. Don't look for peace. Don't look for any other state than the one you are in now. Otherwise, you will set up inner conflict and unconscious resistance. Forgive yourself for not being at peace. The moment you completely accept your non-peace becomes transmuted into peace. Anything you accept fully will get you there, will take you into peace. This is the miracle of surrender. Beautifully put. Again, a recurring theme as we're studying the minds of some of the greatest thinkers is this idea that you should never seek peace outside of yourself. You should never seek strength outside of yourself. You should never seek anything outside of yourself, whether that's, your confidence, for affirmation. Never seek praises from anybody else. Because when you do that, you'll realize that even if you, for a moment, achieve whatever state that you're looking for from the external, it only lasts for a moment. It's impermanent. But if you can find it within yourself, it is permanent, because you go wherever you go. Whereas the praises that you receive, the adulations, the strength that you receive from others, those will fade with time. Those will disappear. Those will change when your situation changes. Another recurring theme that we've seen in other works is this idea of being able to be at peace with yourself in solitude. So Tolle says, if you cannot be present even in normal circumstances, such as when you are sitting alone in a room, walking in the woods, or listening to someone, then you certainly won't be able to stay conscious when something goes wrong, or when you are faced with difficult people or situations. With loss or the threat of loss, you will be taken over by a reaction, which ultimately is always some form of fear and pulled into deep unconsciousness. Those challenges are your tests. Only the way in which you deal with them will show you and others where you are at as far as your state of consciousness is concerned. Right? It's when you are faced with another, when you are in contact with other people, that you will understand what your level of consciousness is. And he's saying it's not your ability to just sit still. And so there's an interesting dialogue that happens between someone who believes that there's no such thing as negative and positive emotions. Right? This idea of labeling something negative and positive, that's the problem. The question is posed to Eckhart Tolle as, but if you call some emotions negative, aren't you really saying that they shouldn't be there? That it's not okay to have those emotions? My understanding is that we should give ourselves permission to have whatever emotions come up, rather than judge them as bad or say that we shouldn't have them. It's okay to feel resentful. It's okay to be angry, irritated, moody, or whatever. Otherwise, we get into repression, inner conflict, or denial. Everything is okay as it is. And now, this is Eckhart Tolle's response. Of course, once a mind pattern, an emotion, or a reaction is there, accept it. You were not conscious enough to have a choice in the matter. That's not a judgment, that's a fact. If you had a choice or realize that you do have a choice, would you choose suffering or joy, ease or unease, peace or conflict? Would you choose a thought or a feeling that cuts you off from the natural state of well-being, the joy of life within? Any such feeling I call negative, which simply means bad. Not in the sense that you shouldn't have done that, but just plain factual bad, like feeling sick in the stomach. How is it possible that humans killed in excess of 100 million fellow humans in the 20th century alone? Humans inflict pain of such a magnitude on another is beyond anything you can imagine. And that's not taking into account the mental, emotional, and physical violence and torture, the pain, the cruelty they continue to inflict on each other as well as on other sentient beings on a daily basis. Coming back specifically to what you said, it is certainly true that when you accept your resentment, moodiness, anger, and so on, you are no longer forced to act them out blindly. You are less likely to project them onto others. But I wonder if you are not deceiving yourself. When you have been practicing acceptance for a while, as you have, there comes a point when you need to go to the next stage, where those negative emotions are not created anymore. If you don't, your acceptance just becomes a mental label that allows your ego to continue to indulge in unhappiness and so strengthens its sense of separation from other people, your surrounding, your here and now. As you know, separation is the basis for the ego's sense of identity. True acceptance would transmute those feelings at once. And if you really knew deeply that everything is okay, as you put it, and of which, of course, is true, then would you have those negative feelings in the first place? Without judgment, without resistance to what is, they would not arise. You have an idea in your mind that everything is okay, but deep down, you don't really believe it. So, the old mental, emotional pattern of resistance are still in place. That's what makes you feel bad. Then this person responds, "That's okay too." To which Tolle says, "Are you defending your right to be unconscious, your right to suffer? Don't worry, nobody's going to take that away from you. Once you realize that a certain kind of food makes you sick, would you carry on eating that food and keep asserting that it's okay to be sick?" That is a fantastic dialogue. Now, whether that dialogue happened in real life or not, the idea that there are no such thing as good and bad, pretty common within New Age philosophies. And this is why I don't think you can put Eckhart Tolle in the school of New Age, though some people want to put him in there, because Tolle's concepts that he's talking about here, and there are tons of things in here that I haven't even gotten to, that he draws a lot from ancient philosophers, ancient theologians, and from religious traditions, such that it's not a shallow understanding of being present. One of the things that Tolle reminded me of, there's a very tiny book called The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence, who is a 17th century monk. And it's his teachings compiled in this tiny, tiny book. And essentially, Brother Lawrence is teaching his reader that to experience the presence of God, you have to be present in the here and in the now. And when you read Brother Lawrence's The Practice of the Presence of God, you will see a lot of similarities between this and the power of now. And this is a practical advice that Tolle gives on how to free yourself from your mind, because he believes that is the true liberation. He says, start listening to the voice in your head as often as you can. Pay particular attention to any repetitive thought patterns, those old gramophone records that have been playing in your head perhaps for many years. This is what I mean by watching the thinker, which is another way of saying listen to the voice in your head, be there as the witnessing presence. When you listen to that voice, listen to it impartially. That is to say, do not judge. Do not judge or condemn what you hear, for doing so would mean that the same voice is coming again through the back door. You'll soon realize there is the voice, and here I am listening to it, watching it. This I am realization, this sense of your own presence is not a thought. It arises from beyond the mind. And with that, I'm going to wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. As always, if you enjoyed this episode and you're not subscribed, do subscribe and give this podcast a rating on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, or wherever you listen to it. Till next week, peace.